definite that I'm dead set on getting through. So this is an opportunity for you all to ask questions, whatever you want. I thought I would start though, just with some of the terminology that we use in the Episcopal Church, some of the things that some of you may have heard of, or you may have heard other people speak of, and you didn't know what they were talking about. And so, kind of as you come into a church, now this church doesn't have one, which most churches do. The narthex is the area outside of where everybody sits. So if there's a hall, if there's anything right out, if there was something other than a porch outside that door in an Episcopal church, it would be called a narthex. Okay? That comes from a Latin word. When you walk in the door, at that point you enter the nave. Okay? So I don't know what you all have been calling this, but that's at least in the Episcopal. The sanctuary. Yeah, that's what most people call it, the sanctuary. But in the Episcopal Church anyway, the word for this area would be nave. The sanctuary, we'll skip ahead to that. The sanctuary is actually only everything from the altar rail back. That's why you all aren't allowed up here. The sanctuary, when you talk about sanctuary in a biblical sense or in the Old Testament sense, the sanctuary is the place where God resides. Okay? And so in the Episcopal Church and in other liturgical churches, that area is only altar rail back, is what we strictly refer to as the sanctuary. Okay? Mike?
Is there a reason you put up a fence that we can't get to you?
There is. That's altar, and I want to talk about that. Most everything that you see in here, most of what we wear, much of what we do, came from either Scripture or the Middle Ages. All right? And so, I'll give you a little background about the altar rail. In the Middle Ages, church was, obviously many of you have seen, churches were often large. They were generally unheated and certainly uncooled. So in the summertime, at night and early into the early morning, they would open all the doors. Right? That's what you do when you don't have air conditioning. That's what we did as a kid. You open up the windows and doors, let that cool air in at night, and then shut it up. They did the same thing with churches. But also in that time, you had lots of domesticated animals that wandered freely. And so, in order to not come into the Mass at 6:30 in the morning and have a big pile of cow poop at the altar, you have an altar rail. And that's why in older churches, particularly in England and things, the altar rails will be solid. They might have some carving and things in them, but you'll see that they're too solid for an animal to get through or past. That's what it originally started out as. Because in that time, people didn't take communion generally more than once a year. This is kind of pre-Reformation, Middle Ages. Communion typically occurred once a year. And so the service, even the service was vastly different than what we might think. When I say the service, I'm talking about the Roman Catholic service, because that was the service then. The Roman Catholic service at that point was still in Latin. Virtually no one spoke Latin, so nobody had a clue what was going on. But generally in Europe, church was mandatory. Okay? You could be fined, you could be in prison, you could be killed for not coming to church if you did it often enough. So people came to church. But in those churches in general, there were no pews, no seats. You need to cram as many people as you could in there, in this space. So people came in and they wandered around freely. It was a social occasion. People talked to each other and they went about their business while the priests were up front saying the Mass in Latin. Okay? Now, if you've been to any Anglo-Catholic churches, you may have at some point in the service heard somebody ring a little bell. So some of you, yeah, heard that. Those are called Sanctus bells. And what that bell was, where it originated, was in the Latin Mass. When you got to one of three places in the service, the first place was the Sanctus, which we do. We do a Sanctus each Sunday. They would ring the bell. Ring the little bell. And what that meant was everybody knew to turn around, okay, something important's happening. All right? Ring the bell. They would do it again at the, what's called the anamnesis, which is from the same word as amnesia, which is the remembrance. When I say, do this in remembrance of me, that's the anamnesis. The last place that they would do that, where would it be? At the parousia. That is the point where we invite the Holy Spirit into the elements. So at those three places, the Sanctus bell would ring. And everybody would turn and say, oh, okay, that's something important happened. So in many Roman Catholic churches and many that's Anglican Catholic churches, they still use Sanctus bells, even though we now do the service in the language that people understand and they can follow it. That's the tradition of it. So people were wandering around in this service talking, the bell would ring, people would turn around, and then generally, except one time a year, the priest would take communion. Lay people only took one time a year, if that. So the altar rail, as I said, was really there to keep animals out. It wasn't until hundreds of years later, after the Reformation, that people actually started regularly going up and kneeling at that rail as we think of it. It was a cattle guard. Okay? Is that a short enough answer to your
That was pretty quick.
Yeah, there you go. So there were a lot of pieces of that. Come on in. You missed the only interesting part of the whole night. So we have the pieces. This is called the nave. When you leave the nave, the area between the nave and the sanctuary is called the chancel. In most churches, that's where the choir sits, but it doesn't have to be. But any gap between the altar rail and the seats is referred to as the chancel. Okay? Now, all of these terms are, as I said, particular to the Episcopal Church, and they go back for 400 or 500 years, none of which you need to know. All right? You're not going to be tested on it. You're not going to be kicked out for not knowing them. But if you're in other places talking with other Episcopalians, they might be using some of these terms. So, or I might use them, not realizing that they're not common speak. So I wanted to make sure you knew that. Nave, chancel, sanctuary. Now the other thing, and this doesn't come up too often anymore, but even as much as 50 years ago, this was a big deal. Churches have an epistle side and a gospel side. Okay? That is where the epistles are read in the Old Testament song, and this is where, in theory, the gospel should be preached. So gospel side. The reason that I say that's important is many of the old traditions that we have in the church were dependent upon that. So when you go into a church, if you were an acolyte and you went into a church, you should know that you were supposed to light the candles on the gospel side of the church first. Now that doesn't always mean the right. The pulpit could be on the right and the lectern's on the left. So you have to reverse the order in which you normally do. That's one example. But there were a lot of things in the service that were dictated by gospel and epistle side. Okay? Now many modern churches only have one podium and there is no pulpit. Most churches, I would say most churches that have been built in the last 30 years only have one place. And they don't have a pulpit and a lectern or epistle side. So I don't know what you do in those churches if you have to pick a side. But that's the history of that. So when you come up, you enter the sanctuary. One of the things that you may have seen, you may have wondered why, is this flickering candle. It's actually a light. Used to be a candle. I don't know when they start changing. I know in my lifetime I've seen them go from candles to lights, but historically that would have been a candle there. And that candle goes by a number of different names. It's a lot of times just called the sanctuary lamp, but it tells you that there is reserved sacrament. Okay? The reserved sacrament is present. Now most churches aren't good about doing it if the reserved sacrament is gone, the light's supposed to go out. But the reserved sacrament is, in essence, either wine and bread that have been blessed and sanctified for this particular purpose, or they're leftovers that have gotten put in. That's generally leftovers that get put in there. And the idea of the reserved sacrament, people have different notions about what it's for or why it's there. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. But essentially what it is that it's a communion that's ready. Should one of you come in to me, and this has happened before, and say, I really need to maybe have confession or talk to you and take communion. So instead of going through the whole communion service, you can do it from the reserved sacrament. Okay? Now, in some places, the reserved sacrament was used for anyone who came in who wanted to take the communion. There might be a little card there, prayers they would read, and then they would kind of administer it to themselves. That fell out of favor, and people started realizing that the wine went much faster than the bread. But that's the idea of the reserved sacrament. And it's a way of saying, at the theological level, the reason it's stuck around is because it's saying, once we bless this bread and wine, we say that that is the genuine presence of Christ with us in the service. So to put it in there, to leave it there, is a physical representation of that presence in the sanctuary. That's why it's persisted for hundreds of years. It's not just so that people can have communion whenever they want. It's that physical representation of the body and blood of Christ in the sanctuary. What else? A few other little things, terms that you may hear people talk about. Credence table. The credence table is to be in a variety of places up in the front. It will always be in the sanctuary. And it's the small table somewhere near the front that the elements for communion are placed on. That's all it is. I know I've heard a half dozen times somebody say something about putting something on the credence table, and somebody said, what's that? That's the credence table. It's just a little table, nothing particularly special about it except its location and its function. Okay? Paten and chalice. When you come in, we don't call it a plate and cup. Although if you say that, I know what you're talking about, and I'll usually respond to you. Paten and chalice. Okay? And those come from Latin words. Doesn't really matter what they mean, but this is what we refer to them as. The bread, the wine, or the paten and chalice. Along with that, we have the purificator. Okay? That is simply used to wipe this down. Now, generally, one of the things you'll find is with all of the linens that are on the altar, they are folded and ironed in a kind of a three-part pattern. Okay, so this has 9 sections, 3 by 3. Same thing for this. This is the corporal, 3 sections. If the fair linen, which is the big one here, were folded, it'd be folded 3 by 3. Anybody have any idea why that might be?
Trinity.
Trinity. There you go. Do you see anything else that's in threes as you look up here? Anybody? Y'all are older. It might be hard to see this far away. Now, most altar rails will have some form of 3 scallop something as the ornamentation on them. Okay? That again is the Trinity. You see this? 3 scallops in that. Almost every church you go into, the altar rail will have on it somewhere. Oftentimes the altar will have something in 3s on it. It's just the Trinity. Okay? So, again, these things get a fancy name, but they really just are here because they have a function. They're to wipe the paten, or the chalice rather, as we're using it. The corporal, as I said, that again comes from the Latin, and it's used, anybody know why we put it down? Yes?
For the spills.
For the spills, that's right. We call it a corporal, and we have kind of a nice, holy thought about it. It's really just there to keep wine from getting on the fair linen, because this is a lot easier to wash than this. Okay? It's a placemat. There you go, Mike. It's a placemat. But it does have the name corporal, and it goes down first, and then the what? Chalice, and then the a little weaker on that one, purificator, and the paten. There you go. So that is the basic elements that we have in order to do communion under. The other book that you will often see sitting up here is the gospel book. This is what we read the gospel out of each Sunday. Now, many priests, most priests, perhaps every other priest I've ever met, uses an altar book, which I don't use. It's a book that, to be honest, I don't even know how to use one. It goes through and it kind of breaks the service up. Like if you're going to do prayer B with such and such a thing, then you can turn to a certain page and you can just read through that, but then you'll have to flip and blah, blah. Well, I don't know my way around that. I know my way around the prayer book, and that's easy enough to get through. So that's what I've always used. But the other big book that you see people using is called an altar book, and it's just the same thing that's in the prayer book, only organized in lots of different ways. So there's nothing particularly special about that book. It's in much larger print, and so forth and so on. So that's what those books are for. Now, the other things that we see around the altar are the candles, the Eucharistic candles. You think back about what I've already told you about the things that we have. Why do you think we have Eucharistic candles? So you can see. That's right. For most of the life of the church, there was not electricity. And so you had candles on the altar so that the priest could read what was going on. Now, when that electricity came around and churches started lighting, churches started putting in electric lights, people said, well, we need to keep the candles. We miss them. Those are nice. So they become Eucharistic candles. And they become a piece of the tradition that is not, quote unquote, necessary. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a camp or in a place where we were doing either an informal or impromptu communion, and somebody will be all bent out of shape because we don't have any candles. Where are we going to find some candles? It's hard to convince people. You don't have to have them, okay? You don't have to have them up there. It's a piece of the tradition. And it's nice. I think it's nice because what all do we do by candlelight these days? Most of us, not much. So it sets things apart a little bit. But it's, again, just a piece of the tradition. For hundreds of years, people had those candles sitting on the altar, and when electricity came along, they decided, well, we don't want to get rid of those. So, here we have it. Well, what else have I missed here? One of the other terms that you might hear is sacristy. What is the sacristy? The sacristy is always the little room, and it's typically right off the chancel or perhaps the sanctuary, usually off the chancel though, where we keep all the linens and things that we use for the altar. And oftentimes we'll keep vestments in there. Vestments are these things which we're going to talk about in a minute that I and or the people helping wear are referred to as vestments. But that's the sacristy. You hear somebody talking about that. Now, vestments. I want to go over that real quick. There are several kinds of vestments that you might see people wear in the Episcopal Church. This one, which is the one I wear every Sunday, is called an alb. Okay? Now, there are a variety of choices that you can use, but basically if you see one that's all white, it's an alb. Okay? The other piece that I wear next is called a cincture. It's a rope. Okay? It's a rope with the intent to be able to hold my stole, which is the next thing. And stoles come obviously in a variety of shapes and colors. They come to match the season. They come to express different things. This one, anybody guess what this one's for? One day. No, not Palm Sunday. Pentecost. Yes, Pentecost. This red is the color that represents the Holy Spirit. Red is the color that we use certainly on Pentecost. We'll use it this Sunday for Palm Sunday as a red Sunday. But this particular one with fire on it and things, this is might be referred to as a Pentecost stone.
It's also garnet and gold, as far as.
No, it's nothing to do with Florida State. God does not like Florida State. But different stoles represent different things, and sometimes you'll go into church and you'll see people wearing them in different ways. You might see somebody wearing a stole like this. What does that mean? They're a deacon. That's right. You might see somebody wearing just a black stole. You might know what that means? Okay, they could be a lector. Some places the lector, the people doing the reading, that's a phrase, lector, wear a black stole. But oftentimes a black stole represents someone who is not ordained but is in training. For instance, if a seminarian came to our church to preach one Sunday, they would wear a black, and it's actually called a tippet. If they're not ordained, it's not a stole. It looks just like it. It's called a tippet. But that's what that is for. Now the other set of vestments that you might see people wearing are this, black and white. The black is called a cassock, okay, and the white is a surplice. Now this is a color scheme or a look that you see more certainly in the Roman Catholic tradition, and you see more in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And that speaks to one of the things that I want to talk about here, and this is as good a place as any to talk about it, is the difference between high and low church. Now, a lot of you have made comments about that. You've talked about that before. Now, oddly enough, the garb of a low church clergyman is this, which I said is typically more, that you might see more in the Catholic Church, people wearing cassocks. But this is the garb of a low churchman, okay? High churchman wears an owl, okay? Now, one of the phrases that gets thrown around a lot is this high church versus low church. And we talk about it, almost universally people talk about it in terms of the way people worship. So if you come into a church and they're using incense and they have sanctus bells and they're doing all this thing, most people would say, well, they're high church, right? That's actually not a correct use of that term, okay? Now, generally, they are high church, but what high church and low church means is an historical notion of how important the church is in terms of salvation, okay? And what we mean by that is a high church is going to be typically Anglo-Catholic, but they're going to have be more towards the Roman Catholic ideal of the church is central in terms of you attaining salvation. In other words, salvation occurs through the church. That's at the far end of high church. The far end of low church is the church has absolutely nothing to do with your salvation. That's worked out between you and God. That's the definition of high church and low church. Now they typically, historically, have played out in those different forms of worship. High church is often more Anglo-Catholic, and the Catholic piece of it is often the incense and bells and chanting and some of the things that we think of as high church. The low church being much more Protestant, if you will, much more Reformation-oriented, stripped down service. That's actually why the black cassock is the garb of a low churchman, because the color black, whether it's in my shirt that I wear on Sunday, whether it's in that cassock, the color black represents servanthood. In the Middle Ages, the only people who wore black were servants. The only people. And so for clergymen, they wore black with one little piece of white. Does anybody know what the white represents? Christ, the light of Christ. That's exactly what it is. And that's why you have the black with the white over it. And that's the same reason the alba is white. Represents the light of Christ. Also in the Middle Ages, wearing something pure white like this would automatically set you apart. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to try to keep something like that clean when you're doing it by hand in a river or something? So if you could as clergy people, wear pure white every Sunday. That was a way of setting yourself apart distinctly from the world, okay? And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean, that was the church's way of saying, what's happening up here is a big deal, and it's worth us buying, making, and keeping these white vestments, okay? Does that make sense? It's probably a lot more than any of you ever wanted to know about this stuff up here. All right? That was all I had for you in terms of kind of the things you see. Do y'all have any other questions kind of in that regard before we start looking at the prayer book and the kind of the things we say and do?
I didn't understand the saved wine, because I thought the priest was supposed to consume all the wine after the service.
Okay. She's asked about what's supposed to happen with the elements after the service. It's funny that you say the priest is supposed to consume all the wine. If you do, you're actually supposed to eat all the bread too. Nobody ever does that, or generally. A lot of people do get rid of the wine. There are one of several ways that is completely acceptable to discard either the bread or the wine. The first is to consume it. Okay? And often, again, in more what we consider high church traditions, that is the tradition, that you consume all of it, the bread and the wine. Okay. Now, the other acceptable means, most churches, and I'm not sure, somebody told me this one is, but I'm not sure if it is or not, is to have a piscina. That is a sink in the sacristy that drains directly into the ground. It doesn't go into the sewer.
That's what ours
It
is.
doesn't go in. Okay.
That goes right in the ground.
Okay. So then that's a piscina in there. And it's acceptable to put the bread and the wine down the piscina so it goes directly to the ground. You can also take it outside and spread it out on the ground, pour it out on the ground. Any of those three ways are equally considered appropriate ways to care for the bread, the wine, the elements after the service. Now, again, like I say, tradition dictates more than right or wrong how people generally do it. I don't like to chug a bunch of wine on Sunday morning. I think I would probably throw up if I tried to drink all that a lot of the time. So it's just something I've never done. So that wine can be kept oftentimes. A lot of times with the reserve sacrament, what we'll do, or what I do here is it's not leftovers. Whenever it's time to change it out, like the wine's ready to be changed, we'll just set an extra cruet out and I'll bless it at the Wednesday service or something, and so it'll get changed out that way. But the wafers, all of that are leftovers from other services. Yeah, Susan.
What about the elements that are taken to home communions? Are they blessed? I mean, if the lay people are taking them into the homes, they have to be blessed at their homes. So does that come from the reserve sacrament?
It can either come, the idea with home communion should be that on Sunday morning, I should bless enough bread and wine that the people who are receiving it immediately that day or the next day should get from the same batch that I did for the whole church. That's the ideal of the way it's supposed to work. Now, if you're just, it's Thursday or Friday and something comes up and somebody needs it, then generally that bread and wine will come out of the reserve sacrament if it needs to be refilled in those kits. But yeah, anything that leaves here in communion kits has already been blessed. Even the communion I take to people is generally already been blessed, unless I know that they want to go through a whole service or whatever to do that. But yeah, it's almost always blessed.
Now, you don't wear the chasuble?
The chasuble, yeah.
Or, because you didn't talk about that, I don't think
Yeah.
you wear it, do you?
No, I don't wear a chasuble. The reason, as you all may have guessed, when I talked about high and low church and the way those things work, I tend to be more low church or broad church in worship. So in theory, I should be wearing the cassock and surplice. I don't because it's hot. Okay? It's just hotter. That's the only reason I wear it now. It's a lot cooler than a cassock and surplice. Now the chasuble, some of you may not have seen that. That is the kind of often heavily ornate kind of I don't know what you call it. Poncho cape that you see priests wear. It generally will cover about right here, often with a lot of gold thread and things in it. I just feel ridiculous wearing it. You know, for some people, for some priests and some congregations, that for them makes it feel more authentic. It sets it apart, and I completely understand. And I've been at places where, you know, filled in at places where that's what they do, and I do it, and I don't have any issue with it. But for me, it's just not something I have ever chose to make a habit of the way I conduct communion. But yeah, it's really kind of more on that high church, low church scale in kind of the wrong way that I said we use it, and where do you fall in that? Most Episcopal churches around here, most of them that you've been to, are broad church. There are very few truly high church or truly low churches around, at least not around here. Now, if you go down, if you go to the coast of South Carolina, Johnny and Jeanette are, you're going to see some more true high church places. If you go to Richmond, Virginia, you're going to see some true high church Episcopal churches. And really the whole coast of Virginia. A little bit on the North Carolina coast, not nearly as much as Virginia and South Carolina. Those were the historic kind of hotbeds of Anglicanism in the United States. And some of those places are still very high church. But there are high church Episcopal churches scattered around throughout the country. But in Asheville, and kind of in western North Carolina, we only have one that you could really consider even comes close to approaching true high church. And that's St. Mary's on Charlotte Street up in Asheville. The church out in Canton does a little more high church. They chant and they do some incense and things, but they're probably a step shy of true high church. But
Father Bucky does that.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a church tradition.
Yeah. So, but it's most churches are a broad church, which means essentially somewhere in the middle. Other question, Joe?
You may have already covered this bowl of water back here, because I took it away. I
Okay.
apologize, maybe you did.
Yeah, no, I didn't. The bowl of water back there, as Joe said, that is the baptismal font, and typically in most Episcopal churches that stays either away or is set in a place for people to see, but it's not used except for baptisms, okay? But in this church, I guess you all have a history of, and there are a number of, quite frankly, former Roman Catholics who like to come in and take the holy water and do the sign of the cross on themselves. And so that's why we keep the water and stuff there.
Mark started that.
Oh, really? So it's
Yeah,
not a
that's
long-standing
just-
tradition?
Yeah, that's just the last
Okay.
year. He explained it and said it was
Okay.
going to, in fact, I think it was Easter.
Okay.
Encouraged it,
Yeah,
encouraged
he
it.
encouraged it.
Yeah, and for many Anglo-Catholics, that's again, kind of that carryover piece of the tradition that they find helpful to their worship. So I don't have an issue with it one way or the other. But that's why there's actually water in there.